We have information that a crime had occurred and somebody been murdered, but we don't have a report of a missing person.
We were able to look in the room. There's no evidence of foul play at all.
She said that everything that's being spoken about was all rumor and innuendo. It could be something, a delusion. It could be just rumors. It was just really hard to tell.
They came up with ideas that Stephen King couldn't come up with.
I think it would have been easy for us to say we did our best and walk away.
These were monsters.
Welcome to Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. Tonight, police work to unravel a horrific tale of torture and murder. But they had no clue if the crime even took place or who the possible victim was. Here now is Nancy Hixt with Deadly Rumours.
In the spring of 2006, Calgary Police received an ominous call about a possible homicide.
Calgary Police emergency?
You know, sometimes we get these phone calls or we get these complaints that come in and they're almost unbelievable when people are intoxicated or they're impaired with by drugs or whatnot. Sometimes the things come in and they don't make a lot of sense. But we did get a phone call in the evening on May 4th, 2006, where an individual said that he believed that somebody had been killed in an apartment.
Police were familiar with the address where the crime allegedly took place. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary two-story home. But this was a bustling rooming house with small living quarters and a lot of tenants.
We had had people, lots of drug activity in this house. And again, there's various apartments within it, but we had had lots of drug activities. I know that we had had murders that had hidden out there and were trying to elude police before.
Officers met with the man who called in the tip. He said he'd been on a drug and alcohol binge when he ended up in one of the apartments. He believed he saw a hand under some clothing on a resident's bed.
It's very possible with some of the clientele that stayed there and whatnot that it might be inaccurate. It could be something, a delusion. It could be just rumors. It was just really hard to tell. I mean, the police officers did a great job. The reality is that there was no legal authority for us to enter that apartment. It was through consent. And those officers went out, talked to the landlord, got access into the apartment, and did a cursory look around. There was no body. There was no obvious signs of any type of foul play at the apartment at all. And at that point, there was nothing really to follow up on. That particular file was done.
Then, 3 days later, on May 7th, 2006, a similar story was once again brought to police.
It provides a little bit more detail around a female victim that was being held against her will, was being tortured, and ultimately was killed. Well, it's difficult because although we are getting the same information from different sources, it is also possible that it was misinformation that went out to different sources. So we don't know if it's actually accurate or not. We had very tenacious investigators assigned, and those investigators wanted to confirm, is this accurate or not? And they began interviewing the people that were coming forward.
Lee Dunbar was a constable at the time and regularly patrolled the area, usually in plain clothes, to keep a low profile.
We were rolling by that house, actually, and we ran into a source that I had who asked to speak to us and once again gave us similar information that the homicide had taken place in that house. No information on name, and some of it's even conflicting, but there seems to be a consistent theme that something's taken place. My partner and I, we did go to the house. We were able to look in the room. There's no evidence of foul play at all. We were looking for things that would have indicated like potential blood or anything like that that would be consistent with a homicide, and we didn't see anything like that.
The officers got into their vehicle to leave the area.
We were approached by another witness who had gave us, I guess, our first real bit of information that would corroborate this. and that was that a homicide had taken place. We were told that the White House, 3 girls that lived there, were responsible for killing a girl who was known to be a rat.
But we start to hear information that a female was lured up to the apartment in order to do drugs. Some people in the apartment thought that she was cooperating with police and was an informant with the police. And as a result, she was tortured, assaulted, and ultimately was killed.
The informant named 3 possible suspects for police to look at.
So we have nicknames of the offenders. Nobody gave us the full name of the potential offenders. We knew that one of the females was named Sarah, and we heard that another one had a nickname of Crazy Chris, and another one was nicknamed Lexi. And so not only are the investigators trying to determine if there's a victim and who the victim is, and if they're alive or not, but also who these offenders are.
A few days earlier, they had disposed of the body, a BFI dumpster outside of the residence. And to further that, in the next couple days now, BFI was going to do its regular pickup, and they were going to dispose of more stuff that would have been evidentiary that we would want to get our hands on. We went to our staff sergeant and kind of explained what had happened, the information we had received, and he had said that we should take this up to homicide.
Back in 2006, resources in the homicide unit were stretched as officers investigated a deadly back and forth between 2 rival gangs.
At that point in time, there was not a lot of interest from homicide. We didn't have identity, and there was nothing really truly that would indicate that this actually took place, aside from the sources that we had that didn't have a lot of reliability, to be honest.
But as more people came forward to police, details of the crime they described became more and more disturbing.
Some of the information that's coming forward about, an offender etching rat on the victim's forehead, the offenders trying to crazy glue close the mouth and the eyes of the victim. It almost seems unbelievable. It seems like something that you would watch in a movie, not something that would happen in downtown in one of our major cities. The challenge is, I've investigated these types of files before, and we find the alleged victim perfectly healthy. They're fine. In some cases, we found a victim of an assault, a serious assault, but they were not murdered, they're fine. And then they're non-cooperative.
We're dealing with very unreliable sources when it comes to the complaints that were generated to the police on this, like a lot of drug use. We had set up a meeting with our inspector at the time. We basically said, do you believe this happened? And we believed it did. Something had happened that at least warranted more investigation. So he endorsed full support from the district.
Would the apartment's dumpster contain evidence to prove that a crime had been committed?
If in fact there was somebody that was seriously assaulted or was killed, there's a great likelihood that there had been some type of cleanup, and knowing that the patrol officers had been there a few days earlier, didn't see anything, there's a very good possibility that there was some type of cleanup, and that cleanup, that garbage would be in that dumpster.
Welcome back to Crime Beat. When police investigated reports of a possible torture and murder of a young woman, they came up empty. But 2 tenacious patrol officers felt the need to push forward, despite the lack of evidence that this crime even happened. Here again is Nancy Hixt with Deadly Rumours.
This is the parking lot where the house was.
A lot has changed in the area since Detective Lee Dunbar regularly patrolled this inner-city community.
It was a large white house with several levels. The door was facing towards 14th Avenue. I remember the actual apartment was on the 2nd floor, and I remember looking through the window so it would have faced 14th Avenue. Okay. And then to the left here was like somewhat of an alleyway, I guess, maybe some parking in the back, but that BFI dumpster was located here by where this Kia car is.
In the spring of 2006, Dunbar and his partner had spent countless days at this address. There were reports a woman had been violently tortured and killed, and evidence disposed of in the building's dumpster.
The best piece we had was, aside from the multiple complaints that this took place, was that there was going to be potentially evidence in this new bin, so we were kind of excited about that.
Police didn't want anyone to know about their plans to seize and search the dumpster.
We don't have an awful lot to go on in the investigation, so we can't really get any warrants right now, so not interrupting that, whatever that game plan that they would have had in place was super important. The next day was the pickup for the BFI dumpster bin that was sitting outside of the residence. My partner and I worked with BFI, and we had an independent truck come pick up the bin at the scheduled time, and we brought the bin back to our identification section where we had it dumped.
The contents of the dumpster needed to be treated like a possible crime scene.
This was not considered a homicide, so we didn't have the support of major crime protocol. We just, my partner and I, took apart the dumpster.
Acting Detective Lee Dunbar at the time, he and I liaised and worked together in ensuring that any exhibits that he or others had seen seized at the White House or the dumpster were correctly preserved and documented. Documentation is a huge part of this, because not only do you have to identify and preserve an exhibit, but you also have to have it preserved in a proper fashion, in that when it comes to presentation at court, that it withstands a court challenge.
Dunbar and his partner meticulously combed through piles of garbage and documented what they found.
These are all the exhibits with my initials on them, LD, as in Lee Dunbar. We saw there was female clothing, we saw there was hair, razor blades, and duct tape, which all was consistent with some of the information we had received prior to getting to that point. Still at that point in time, we didn't know anything happened more than potentially an assault. Really, there was not enough blood in that dumpster to jump to a homicide.
There seemed to be corroboration to what the witnesses were saying. They did say that the victim had her hair cut, and so there's clumps of hair. They did say that some of that clothing was used to mop up blood and wipe up blood, and sure enough, there's bloody clothes in there.
Inside the garbage, there were a couple of crumpled up notes. One had handwritten lines with the words, "I'm a goof," written over and over.
In a prison system, being called a goof is one of the worst things that can happen in that environment. A goof within that context is a child killer, a molester, or a police informant. And so that term goof, which for most of us doesn't really mean much, is something very, very significant in that world.
This seemed to corroborate the information the original tipster provided in referring to the victim as a possible rat. Police also found ripped up photos.
So the investigators were able to piece those, or at least some of those photographs, back together. And some of the photographs were photographs of smaller children, but there was also some adults that were in there. And the investigators were able to send those out within the service to see if anybody recognized any of the people in the photographs. So investigators were able to identify one of the adult females in the photograph as Alexis Vandenberg, who also went by the name Lexi. And that matched up with what we were hearing from some of the witnesses, where they said that a female by name of Lexi was actually one of the offenders and had also been assaulting the victim. And the other piece, as the investigators are trying to put together a timeline, is they realized that we're probably a few days behind, that this probably took place a few days earlier, and it's just now starting to come out.
Police confirmed garbage was taken away every Wednesday, which meant investigators missed intercepting a dumpster a week earlier.
We contacted them to find out the last pickup, where that would have been dumped. We attended the dump and they showed us. We actually had them cordon off, section off the area that where the body may have been disposed of and then later dumped. I'm going to say it probably was half the size of a football field and about 10 feet deep. So we're still uncertain really, but now our next step is to dig up that dump.
Within a week of the initial reports of a possible torture and murder of a woman in a downtown Calgary rooming house, police finally had some evidence to suggest this was not just a rumor. Items seized from a dumpster pointed to a violent crime. The question was, did other evidence, including a body, already make its way to the dump?
I was involved in some of those early conversations, and I was very skeptical. There's no guarantee that we would find a body. There's not even a guarantee that a body is in there, that we have a victim in there. But if we don't search, we don't know.
The homicide unit agreed to take the case. Detective Dunbar and his partner were seconded to the team to lead the investigation. On May 16, 2006, nearly 2 weeks after the original tip to CPS, a massive police presence converged on a southeast Calgary landfill to begin what seemed like an impossible task. Somewhere buried under 500 metric tons of garbage, police believe they'll find a young woman's body.
At this time, we don't know who this person is. We have an estimate age range of the late teens to early 20s.
This homicide investigation actually began at the beginning of May. That's when police first got a strange tip that an unknown female may have been murdered.
As a result of the efforts of the investigators, they retrieved additional evidence which would suggest that the original information was accurate and credible.
We were fortunate in our city with that particular company in that landfill that they actually do track where dumpsters get dumped within the landfill. And again, it's not an exact science, but it does help us. And so if we say from this address, where would this dumpster have been dumped in a very, very large landfill, even which landfill would have been used, because we have several, they are able to give us that information. Not all landfills do that, not all cities do that, and so that is a key piece for us.
The search was daunting, slow and tedious.
An area that's 100 feet long by 20 feet wide by 10 feet deep. And that is waste material that's compacted and soil is added and topped over. We have to show our due diligence to ensure that we've done what we can to ensure that there has not been a homicide.
At the same time, police were working on several other investigative avenues.
Sometimes in some investigation you go from A to B to C to D, and other times you are all over the place because there's lots of things happening at the same time.
There was a lot of doubt on whether or not we were able to be able to identify this person, and some skepticism as to whether or not this actually took place.
It is very difficult to investigate a potential homicide when you don't have a victim, you don't have any physical evidence, and in fact you don't even know who the possible victim is. As the investigators are talking to the witnesses, they're hearing a couple different names and some descriptions. They heard a name of Rachel, possible Rachel. They heard another name of Rochelle, perhaps. But there's all these names going around, and not just names of the victim, but also names of the possible offenders. And so nobody comes forward and says, here's the driver's license of the person that we think is a suspect or the victim.
We've been working with the missing person coordinator in Calgary, the RCMP, the CARE project in Edmonton, the Edmonton City Police, as well as the RCMP, trying to determine if in fact there's a missing person that we can concentrate on.
But every lead came up short.
And they track somebody down and they find out it's not the person they're looking for, and in fact that particular individual is fine and they're healthy, and so that's not the person.
Police were also working to identify the remaining 2 suspects, as Alexis Vandenberg was identified following the search of the dumpster.
So we put surveillance resources on the apartment. And one of the surveillance actually saw what he believed was people inside the apartment cleaning the walls of the apartment with a mop, is what it looked like to that person. If that was the case, knowing as we put everything together, it certainly looks like they're trying to destroy evidence or cover up evidence.
Police finally got a warrant to search the rooming house.
This here is a presumptive test for blood.
A forensic examination of one of the rooms showed evidence the original patrol officers who first responded weren't able to see.
We have some signs that the people in the building had tried to clean up the walls and paint the walls. We have signs of some blood stains in the carpet.
It was during that search that police identified a second possible suspect alleged to be involved in the homicide.
When we go and talk to the landlord is able to confirm the identity of Sarah, and that's Sarah Rowe. So as we do backgrounding on these individuals and with information we were receiving from the witnesses, some of whom knew at least parts of these offenders, we knew that they're sex workers. We knew that many of them were addicted to crack cocaine. And we also knew that some of them were violent, and they were violent against other sex workers. And that was information that we were getting. Because those people had come forward and told us what Sarah had disclosed to them, we went looking for Sarah.
Police arrested Sarah Rowe and took her to police headquarters for questioning.
Obviously, we're interested in what Sarah's role was in this assault and possible murder. And we questioned her about her role. We questioned her about what she had been telling people. But Sarah says that, yes, she's cut people's hair off before as a punishment for being disrespected, but she did not assault anybody.
Investigators said they didn't have enough evidence to charge Rowe in relation to the homicide.
Sarah was charged with possession of drugs. She said that everything that's being spoken about was all rumor and innuendo, and she had nothing to do with anybody's murder.
In the spring of 2006, Calgary Police spent grueling days sifting through piles of garbage at this southeast city dump in hopes of solving a murder mystery.
Yeah, I went to the dump regularly, and it was absolutely incredibly filthy, disgusting way to spend your days in the hot heat of summer. This is a medical waste area as well, and it's one of the reasons we couldn't bring a cadaver dog in there.
At that time, Sean Gregson was a constable with the Calgary Police Priority Crimes Unit.
We specialize in undercover work, a lot of covert assistance throughout the service. A lot of times, these are the things that the general public don't hear about, don't see, and we tend to like to keep it that way. A lot of resources go into these investigations. It could include Part 6 wiretap authorizations, surveillance. Ultimately, we're trying to provide the truth and seek the truth for what occurred.
Police confirmed Sarah Rowe still lived at the White House with Alexis Vandenberg. Officers also learned there was another roommate, known as Crazy Chris, confirmed to be another sex worker named Crystal Struthers. Investigators decided Sarah Rowe would become the target of their undercover operation.
In this particular case, I was the file manager working with our undercover operators and as a liaison with our homicide unit. They'd received some information that they deemed to be credible, that somebody had been murdered. However, at this time, this would have been about May of 2006. There was no victim that had been located. They did have a first name or a possible first name of Rachel or Rochelle.
That's when Sarah Rowe met several new friends.
Well, the goal of the undercover operators is always to find the truth. And so in this case, it's to find out, was Sarah in fact involved in this homicide? Were there others involved in a homicide? Was there even a homicide? And then who is the victim and where is the victim? Because although the landfill site is going on, it's possible that the victim's not even there.
The operation was risky, and it would take time for the target to trust her new friends and potentially open up.
When you're looking at undercover work, it is very dangerous. It's not only dangerous because you are trying to befriend a killer or a potential killer, it's also dangerous because of the activity that sometimes these people are involved in, also the people that they hang out with.
So my job is to speak with the investigators, and they give me some information on what occurred at that time. And then I take that back, and I don't release that information to my team, but I said, we have information that somebody's been murdered. We don't know who, and we think we know who was involved in this. So then we're gonna try to gain some information to help the investigators bring the information forward. If we can do that and obtain information or statements from our suspects at the time that'll be admissible in court, that's our main goal.
While the undercover operation's going on, there's a fairly significant story in the media.
Police are going through missing persons files in an attempt to identify possible victims. The biggest challenge now, finding a body to see if this homicide investigation is truly a homicide.
We've had those challenges in the past. The report of a homicide certainly has to be supported by some real evidence to suggest that the homicide occurred.
It was something that Sarah Rowe saw in the media, and she commented to the undercover operators that the police really didn't have very much. She felt fairly confident that the police were not going to find the victim.
Sarah Rowe became more bold in her statements to her new friends.
As this investigation progressed, there was little pieces of information that were coming forward that seemed to corroborate the initial information and lend credibility to this, really what seemed like a crazy story.
And one of the things Sarah Rowe had told the operators is that another person that was there by the name of Lexi had told Sarah that the victim was actually a police informant, that the victim had gone to the police and that resulted in somebody being arrested. And so they believe that she was an informant for the police.
On June 8, 2006, undercover officers pulled up to a convenience store just down the road from the rooming house. That's where they met up with Sarah Rowe as she disclosed chilling details of a homicide.
Our undercover operators brought information back that included injuries that had occurred to the victim, which at that point was unknown, and also how the victim was disposed of.
Sarah Rowe also disclosed that she had carved a word in the victim's forehead. She also talked about how the victim was a goof, and she made the victim write out some lines saying, "I'm a goof."
Rowe told the officers nobody knew the victim, adding she only met her a few times. She said the victim was looking for drugs, and Rowe, along with her friends Lexi and Chris, led her into their room to smoke crack.
So as this is going on, we're feeding the information back to the investigative team, and they're determining whether it's credible or not.
She doesn't confide with them everything she did and her role. Often what we find, even when we do undercover operations, is that people will say what puts them in the best light possible depending on the audience. And so she didn't confide everything that she did, but she did confide that she was concerned that she was going to go to jail for a murder.
But weeks into the search, police still hadn't found a body.
When we go back to the original day when we went to section off this area, that was best guess from somebody who worked there, right? And it was reasonable. So we finished the search. There was a day when we were completed the entire search and not recovered anything. It was short-lived after that. We were not going to have a lot more support.
It is frustrating doing a landfill search like that, as it is with any large search. We're not always successful.
After 5 weeks of arduous work, the search was being called off.
We were desperate now. In a couple of days this was going to be shut down. We still didn't have a name, we didn't have a body. So totally defeated.
Investigators felt they were so close, they couldn't walk away. That's when undercover officers learned key information from their target, Sarah Rowe.
One of the things that Sarah said that she had done was she had wrapped the body in plastic, in saran wrap. She talked about how she had dealt with the body in a fair bit of detail, and had also wrapped the body in some blankets or sheets, and then had put the body in a hockey bag. That wasn't anything that we had released publicly to anybody. She then talked about how she had taken the victim and she had put the victim in the BFI bin that was outside her apartment, and she had done that a week before we showed up. It's provided us enough information that we were now starting to realize that for sure Sarah had killed a victim. But a decision was made to continue and just go a few feet on either side of the area that had already been searched. We had a large machinery and we were just going to go 2 more bucketfuls all the way around the perimeter. Let's just try a little bit more. We've already invested well over a month into this. It was costing a significant amount of resources. Again, we had pulled patrol officers off of the street to do this very, very difficult work. And we thought we were already invested. Let's just try a little bit more.
Later that same day, a break in the case.
It wasn't a couple hours later he called me and said, "We got it. We've located her body." I was in disbelief. As a matter of fact, I believe I hung up on him a couple times because I was a little stressed about something else I was doing. But he was insistent, so I went down there and we had located her body in a black hockey bag.
Welcome back. More than a month after police began scouring a Calgary landfill, they finally got a break in the case. But even though investigators had located a body, there were still a lot of unanswered questions. Here now is Nancy Hixt with the conclusion of Deadly Rumours.
It's been 5 weeks of searching through 500 metric tons of garbage, and finally police have found what they've been looking for. The homicide unit confirms they found a body, although it was found outside the original search area. The Calgary Police Homicide Unit isn't saying too much about the discovery of the body just yet. Investigators are waiting for an autopsy to be completed. When police finally located the body of a woman buried deep under piles of compacted garbage, they hoped they'd be able to identify her. But 5 weeks in the sweltering heat in a landfill made that process difficult.
The body's been exposed to the elements, the machinery, and as well as being extracted from the ground.
So now what we still didn't know a month later, even with locating the victim inside this hockey bag, we still didn't know who the victim was. And so one of the things that we turned our attention to is some forensics to try to identify who the victim was.
We next attended the autopsy of the remains on Monday, the 26th of June, 2006. And as the primary forensic investigator, it was my role to seize the property, primarily. That would be examined and submitted for testing to the RCMP lab if required. And my partner, she took the photos of the property seized as well as all autopsy photos.
I attended the autopsy. If you can imagine the equipment that's used in in a dump site. She was quite disfigured. I don't think there's a bone in her body that wouldn't have been broken.
The medical examiner was not able to identify the victim.
Given the passage of time, the conditions in which her remains were located, it was important that as much of her identifying marks, in this case friction ridge fingerprints, were preserved.
Samples were sent to the RCMP Forensic Lab in Winnipeg.
2006 was very much in the CSI, what we termed the CSI effect. In other words, people were expecting things to be done like that, and the results would always be positive, which of course they weren't always positive. Sometimes people didn't get the results that they wanted. In this specific case, I think we submitted 2 or 3 different sets of exhibits for analysis.
One of the things that we did notice, though, is that there was a lot of plastic on the victim. We noticed that there were blankets and other wraps around the victim, and that again corresponded with what we were hearing from Sarah Rowe when she disclosed that to the undercover operators.
There was a belief that the victim had been possibly tortured, and in an attempt to corroborate what they believed, samples were taken from the victim's remains and processed through the crime labs. The final report indicated that there was indications of torture, including the remains of some cyanoacrylate or crazy glue on the victim's eyelids.
There was injuries and circumstances around how the victim was located that we were able to corroborate through the information that we'd gained in our operation. So proving our suspect's involvement.
We have Sarah Rowe that has made confessions to multiple people, including the undercover police officers, and so we charge her with second-degree murder. What's unique about this one is that because we don't know who the victim is, we actually don't name a victim. We say the victim is unknown, but might go by the name of Rochelle.
That charge was later upgraded to first-degree murder. Alexis Vandenberg and Crystal Struthers faced the same charges.
So we had all 3 of those women that had been identified as being potential offenders were identified and charged with the victim's murder.
Because there was a confinement involved, and because the events took place over such a period of time, that planning and deliberation would have come into it. So they could have got to first-degree murder in probably a couple of different ways.
Veteran defense lawyer Balfour Durr represented Crystal Struthers.
This is one of my more memorable cases because of the horrific things that these 3 accused did to the deceased. They did things that, when I heard the description of it, I asked my client, where in the world did that come from? And the answer was something like, it just happened. And if you pardon my language, my answer was, because I was astounded, and I said, no, shit like that doesn't just happen.
The alleged motive was just as the original tipster had suggested, that the offenders believed a rumor about the victim.
They were involved in some serious drugs. They were involved with some serious people. And how it all began was that the 3 who were accused believed that the 4th had ratted out their dealer. And that's what started this whole thing. And no doubt they were under the influence of intoxicants of maybe some or all types, but they believed that this 4th person, the deceased, was the one who was responsible for their dealer ending up in jail, being charged, and they were going to make amends for that.
In the end, the 3 accused did not stand trial.
And that's where the plea bargain came in, simply because they were going to have issues proving the case, because there wasn't any one eyewitness who could identify who did what. And the prosecution needed to rely on the other accused to testify against my client. And I think that in the end, that's what motivated the prosecution to make a plea bargain with me on behalf of my client, where my client pled guilty to manslaughter and avoided a first-degree murder charge.
Struthers was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. Alexis Vandenberg also pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. She was sentenced to 9 years in prison. And then, in November of 2008, 2.5 years after the deadly rumor surfaced, Sarah Rowe pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 12 years.
It's the degree of depravity in this case that sets it apart from, I'm having trouble thinking of the number of thousands of cases I've done, anything close to that. They somehow fueled themselves. They came up with ideas that Stephen King couldn't come up with in one of his horror stories.
Thanks to the tireless work by forensic investigators in obtaining fingerprints from the victim, police were finally able to identify her.
When we were finally able to identify the victim is a 35-year-old mom by the name of Rochelle Friars.
Some patrol members, prior to the homicide, had witnessed the victim making phone calls from a payphone booth where a vehicle showed up shortly thereafter, and it appeared to be a drug transaction. Those patrol members conducted a traffic stop afterwards, and I believe they arrested the guys that were in the vehicle, leading them to believe that the victim had set them up.
This was a complete waste. There's nothing to corroborate that the victim was a police informant.
This picture was presented in court. It was one of the last known photos taken of Rochelle Friars in Ontario, right before the mother of 3 moved to Calgary.
It's sad when you think that somebody lost a life based on a rumor, based on what somebody thought, and in reality had nothing to do with the police, and somebody's making up stories about her, essentially. A victim that was a mother, a victim that obviously was addicted to drugs, but had done nothing wrong. A victim that was held against her will. She was tortured for the amount of time she was there. I can't imagine what her final hours were like.
Whenever Staff Sergeant Lee Dunbar passes through this area, he thinks about the case that all started with a rumor. Had it not been for Dunbar and his partner's persistence, this horrific crime could have easily gone unsolved.
Kudos goes out to the investigators and their tenacity. Otherwise, you'd have this mom of 3 children that would be murdered, and the family would never know what actually happened to her. So the fact that the investigators and everybody else involved in this file continued to work hard, even not knowing whether or not there was even a murder, but they continued to press and press and press. And as a result, they did exactly what we hoped to do, which is give answers to the family, albeit a sad ending and not the ending we want. We're at least able to give the victim a say, and the victim's family information as to what happened.
There was just too much information there to not investigate, and it needed an answer either way. It was bittersweet.
In a victim impact statement written in 2008, the mother of Rochelle Friars said she would never be able to get over what happened to her daughter. The White House, where this brutal crime took place, was ravaged by fire and eventually torn down. All 3 offenders are now out of prison. Sarah Rowe will remain on parole for the rest of her life. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. Want more episodes of Crime Beat? Listen to the Crime Beat podcast, now for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. And for past episodes of Crime Beat, go to the Global TV app, visit globaltv.com, or check out our Crime Beat YouTube page.